How do you think Jujutsu Kaisen will end?
Well, that's a good question, Bumpus.
I don't think it'll be a very happy ending.
I think in the ensuing battle, then we're gonna get more of Sukuna's backstory.
I would say that I think Juji Itadori is gonna sacrifice his life in a way so that Sukuna can die. So both of them are gonna just die. A bit of a parallel with how at the beginning of the series, Juji getting Sukuna into his body. Now we've seen the flip side with Megumi with Sukuna.
I would imagine is like Yuji being alone. I don't think he'll be able to fully save anyone.
I also don't even know how could Juji even take down Sukuna.
Somewhere along the way, Yuji's gonna make him feel something that's not apathy and rage. Sukuna then kills himself, still gonna die on his own terms, like kind of have the last laugh type thing.
Guys, we did it! We beat Sukuna! I think this is what they call Jujutsu Kaisen. Hit it!
I got this feeling inside my bones. It goes electric, wavy when I turn it.
Man, I sure wish Gojo was here to see this. Did somebody say Gojo? Gojo!
Sunshine in my pocket. Got that good?
You got room for one more? Ryomin Sukuna? That's right, chat. I've learned the era of my ways, and now I'll be a jujutsu sorcerer one day, just like y'all. Get in here! And then they all had gay sex and lived happily ever after. What a great story. My experience with Jujutsu Kaisen was quite the roller coaster. I remember watching the first few episodes when they came out and just not being interested at all. But as time went on and as more episodes came out, I became so much more invested in this story. When season 1 ended, I decided I'm gonna go read the manga. And when I finished the Shibuya Incident arc, I went from a moderate enjoyer of the series to a JJK stan and rally behind the idea that this would go down as one of the best Nujin in the magazine. So as Jujutsu Kaisen kept going, it rose to immense acclaim, and a lot has happened since then. Massive praise for its stellar anime adaptation, a lot of love and criticism for many of the writing choices Gege would go on to make, and a fandom that lost its fucking mind. My last video was pretty general regarding the manga, and I feel like my understanding of the story has definitely grown since then. At least a little bit. So this video is not necessarily gonna have a defined question or thesis like some of my other videos, but a more general discussion on the ending and some of the events leading up to it. Because gone are the days of phrases like let it cook every time someone starts getting bored with the story, or the weekly burnout leading to other phrases like the Sukuna cycle, having way too many theories to even count, and loose threads let's be honest, we were really scared just wouldn't be addressed. We can finally look at Jujutsu Kaisen in retrospect. There was a lot happening during the Shinjuku Showdown, and while many of us were getting really confused as to where the story was going, as time went on, major questions started getting addressed, and major checkboxes were being checked. We finally learned that Yuji is Sukuna's nephew, Todo came back, we finally got to see Yuji's domain, etc, etc. Maybe not everyone got the screen time or developments of that nature that we were hoping for, but Shinjuku Showdown did make sure that every character did something. Or at least most of them did. Opinions on Shinjuku, as divisive as they were, did not stop me from having a great time. Despite the odd decisions, I thoroughly enjoyed Shinjuku. The momentum of the arc combined with action more brutal than we've ever seen before made this arc incredibly memorable. Every week was an event. We didn't know what was gonna happen, we didn't know if it was gonna happen, but wherever you were on the spectrum, you were there for the leaks. For me, things really started looking up around chapter 265. 265 did a lot to push for the character writing. This was some much needed introspection in a story that, up to that point, didn't seem to put too much emphasis on characterization. Yuji taking Sukuna through his childhood just to find any kind of empathy within him was such a beautifully done chapter. 266 was also able to carry on the momentum laid from last chapter. The way it's framed, you can feel that this is the final showdown, such a perfect transition to the final 5 chapters of the story. Wait, did I read that right? Let me check here. Oh yeah, there it is. Yeah, it's right there. When it was announced that Jujutsu Kaisen was ending in 5 chapters... What? Okay. So there were a lot of things circling in my mind, because on one hand, there were definitely ways that Gege could resolve the series in an interesting way. Mother 3, for example, is one of my favorite games of all time, and you don't really get a proper rising climax until like the last hour or so of the game. And to this day, I still consider that one of my favorite endings in fiction. And Gege has proven that he is a writer that can do a lot for a story in just 1 chapter. So I didn't think that this news was necessarily the end of the world, but like 5 chapters, oh my fucking... That's like barely 1 episode. There were things that made me very concerned. I genuinely had no idea how they were gonna handle Hakare versus Uraume, what's happening with all these characters and their fates. The world building of JJK at that point was so strange. There were a lot of concepts and aspects of JJK that didn't really get fleshed out like they would in a traditional story. I excused a lot of these things with the expectation that all of these ideas would come full circle towards the end. But now that we're literally at the end with so many things still open, it made a lot of people, including myself, very concerned. But from this one excerpt, Gege seemed at least fairly confident in this ending, as his editor said it was satisfying, and he himself thinks it'll be satisfying, whatever satisfying means in his eyes. So, you know what? We've gone this far, I'm all ears. I couldn't really say anything until I saw the final chapter. So after all of this buildup, all of these fan speculations and theories, and all of the hype placed on Jujutsu Kaisen to be the next great shonen, did the ending land? If you've been online, you've probably heard all the reception, you've seen all the tweets, blah blah blah. But what does Fumbus Wumbus think of this ending? So how do I put this? Realistically speaking, this is not the worst ending ever. There are plenty of more offensive endings out there, and I'd say on its own, it's average or even okay. But relative to what I was hoping for, and what I thought Jujutsu Kaisen as a story was capable of, what I thought it could be, this is the worst ending ever. But also not really. Look, we'll get into it. Now, to be honest, I was one of those people that had very big expectations for how Jujutsu Kaisen would end. I even basically made my own headcanon of what I thought would have been a cool ending. My idea, in short, was that Yuji was going to be the last man standing and the merger would activate, causing this very Evangelion-esque ending, sort of like the Third Impact if you've seen the movie, where you get a very abstract look at everything only to lead to a seemingly world-ending event, leaving readers with an ambiguous conclusion as to what really happened. Not only do I feel like this would fit Jujutsu Kaisen's more somber tone, but to me it felt like JJK was going in a direction where it didn't seem like we were going to get all the questions answered in a satisfying way. Or at least not satisfying in the traditional sense. To me, it seemed like it was going to be one of those stories where it gives you a lot of ideas and tools to play with for the viewer to draw meaning from, kind of like a shonen Evangelion or 2001: A Space Odyssey. It would also just make the ambiguity of things like the Heian era more forgiving, letting the viewer know that the story wants you to think and interpret things in different ways. Of course, some people wouldn't like this kind of ending due to the pure nature of it, but in a series already full of questionable writing decisions, I think we were at the point where the ending would almost make or break the series. So if you're gonna subject me to this much shit and this many loose ends, at least give me a cool ending. I would rather Gege go big, do something extremely unconventional, and leave a lasting impression on me than just watch him try his best to tie up loose ends as fast as possible. But despite that, I'm not gonna judge the ending based on how I thought Jujutsu Kaisen quote-unquote should have ended. Even though I'm gonna go in pretty hard, I'm gonna try my best to judge the ending on its own merits. Even if it hurts. I hope JJK fans will listen to what I have to say, because I feel like a lot of them tend to dismiss the criticisms with these chapters as people not knowing what they want or people just wanting Gege to kill everyone. But to be fair, this is another issue with fans voicing their concerns in a pretty shallow manner when the problems with the ending run much deeper than just nobody died or yap session chapter, blah blah blah. So even if I get very passionate about how I feel about the ending, I hope you'll come to understand where I'm coming from. The ending chapters of Jujutsu Kaisen left me pretty disappointed for a while. There were some elements you could say started at chapter 267, but where I lost all hope was in chapter 268. But first, 267 was good. It's not the best Kaisen chapter, but it was still interesting. Let me just say, I like Nobara's comeback. I think if Gege didn't do anything with her character, it would make the vagueness surrounding her way more questionable, but it's more so the things surrounding the comeback that I don't really like, such as the fact that it happened way too late in the story to add anything meaningful to Nobara's character as it stands, as well as the fact that because we barely got any insight to her status at all, it makes me question how much Gege really thought this through. It feels like he left the door a little too open regarding her status, which led him to making this last-minute feeling decision. But it's still a cool moment nonetheless, and not too big of a deal, I suppose. Chapter 268, on the other hand, if I could describe this chapter in simple terms, it would be the classic phrase, good ideas, poor execution. To me, it is a collection of good scenes clumsily thrown together to give you a pretty unorthodox experience. And not in a good way. I like the idea of Megumi wanting to live a little longer for Yuji. I think the concept's cool. For me, I just think the way we get there was a bit too quick. In the last two chapters, we were shown Megumi being basically done with life. Yuji comes in to tell him that he will miss him, causing Megumi to finally rise to the occasion. I like this in a vacuum, but again, it feels like the arc of him wanting to live again started and ended a bit too quickly. I guess you can argue since Yuji and Megumi are such good friends, Yuji saying this was enough for Megumi to want to keep going because of how much he cares for Yuji, but I don't know, I still think from a narrative perspective, a more gradual transition and, build up would have been way more satisfying given how much Megumi had been suffering up to that point. And also because friendships in JJK always felt pretty underdeveloped in general, but yeah. Sukuna's final moments are fine. I wasn't expecting him to be a piece of goop by the end, but it is a fitting conclusion, I suppose. And I think him saying Yuji's real name was very much appreciated. The thing that kills this send-off for me is more so its presentation. Look at Jogo or Mahito. I'm not trying to compare the context or themes behind their send-offs, because they're completely different. It's simply that they're just more memorable. Jogo's death was so touching and beautifully worded. This scene between Yuji and Mahito was so cinematic, so gripping. And here, Sukuna's death just kind of feels like, well, that happened. In terms of composition and the general feel of the scene, it kind of feels like it's just doing its job and nothing really more than that. And the "you are me" line, whatever you think it means is your interpretation, and I respect that. But just the way it's delivered feels kind of flat and not super earned. It's hard to explain, but you don't get this feeling that this is the final send-off for the main antagonist of the series. Probably because it's actually not. Hint, hint, nudge, nudge. And Hikari versus Urame was just so poorly handled. I get this fight was never supposed to be super important thematically or narratively, but it's just set up in a way that creates anticipation, as in, yeah, I want to see the fight. I've heard people say that a full fight would have just been repetitive or unnecessary or one too many, but it's like, dude, this entire series has been fights. It is a battle manga. We want to see the fights. Sukuna's Gauntlet alone was like 30 chapters. One more fight isn't gonna make this manga feel dragged out. In fact, it would have probably helped draw attention away from the Sukuna cycle allegations and make me feel something when they died. I don't have a problem with the way Urame dies. I mean, with everything we know about them, this is probably the only way they could have died. But I just felt nothing reading this page. I didn't expect them to have an extremely developed character, but seeing the fight and some dialogue between the two would have given this moment at least a bit more weight. And if I'm being completely honest, I think this fight turning out the way it did was less of a conscious decision by our can-do-no-wrong author Gege to not show this fight, as it would distract from the main attraction, and more so a result of Gege just not having the energy to do this fight. Because making manga is very hard. You can say, oh, it wouldn't be important given the time we have, blah, 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 but that's the thing. It's not a conscious decision. It's a compromise. The time skip towards the end of the chapter is weird for me. I love this scene of the trio finally reconnecting again in isolation, but the fact that it marks the end of the Shinjuku Showdown and is such an abrupt shift in tone is what bothers me. Everything about this chapter just feels rushed. I know JJK fans hate this term, but I'm sorry, there's no other way I can look at it. Even for Gege, this is too fast. There are too many things Gege is trying to wrap up in one chapter, and when I read this, I just sat there and I was like, that's it? Chapter 269 happens, and this is the chapter that pretty much crushed any, if not all, expectations that there would be an upswing or a shocking reveal. This is just going to be Gege tying up loose ends as fast as possible. Right. In short, most of the chapter is just them talking about their fight with Sukuna, aka Gege telling the reader why the characters made the decisions they did and why you're wrong for thinking otherwise. Then we get a fair amount of insight on Simple Domain because... And then it ends off with Mei killing this old lady, which was presumably before Shinjuku. Why are you doing this now? There's a place for this kind of thing, but when we have 3 chapters left, this just felt so unnecessary. I feel like we could have spent time on literally anything else. I'd much rather have this chapter be more emotionally driven, where the characters are really contemplating the events that took place, rather than just the strategies involved. Like, you get some of that, but like, barely. And the scenes with Mei and the candy shop just feel so out of place in this chapter. People thought that this was going to be a teaser for a war arc, but instead it was just something that happened before Shinjuku, bringing a close to the higher-ups in the 3 clans situation. But why wasn't this before Gojo versus Sukuna? Having this in conjunction with the scene of, let's say, Gojo killing the higher-ups would have been so much more tonally consistent and just way less confusing. It just feels like he forgot to do this and put this in the 3rd to last chapter, hoping it would tie things up. Now, if I had to describe the biggest issue with this ending overall, it would be that so many things just didn't amount to anything in the end. Sure, we can talk about the merger not happening or whatever the fuck happened with Kenjaku, right? But even things being set up as something bigger in the same arc didn't do anything. Yuta being alive makes sense. It is explained reasonably. But look at how big of a deal it was when Yuta controlled Gojo's body. This 5-minute warning. This theme presented of Yuta having to be the monster after Gojo died. This somber panel that juxtaposes his dire battle against Sukuna. All of these things led to the expectation that there would be bigger consequences than what ended up happening. Nothing. All that setup for nothing. Same with Higuruma. Sure, they probably got his body on time and Shoko did her magic. Okay, whatever. That's fair. But what was the point of drawing this parallel between him and Nanami's death? What was the point of showing Yuta thinking about him, insinuating his death? He also just kind of shows up very unceremoniously. What do these things do? And don't give me that, oh, well, it ties into the themes. Or, oh, well, this was necessary in beating Sukuna. No, that's not what I mean. I mean, what does this do for the story? How do these events change the narrative moving forward? Megumi living for Yuji, Sukuna's end, Nobara's comeback, just 269 as a whole. All of these ideas in a bubble are fine. But with the context, the fact that this is all happening in the last 5 chapters, the way these events are paced, the placement of these events, even just the way these things are depicted is what makes the ending of Kaisen so disappointing. It feels so disconnected from everything before, and it feels like the ending to a different story almost. But that's okay, because you can explain a lot of these things with the power of themes. It's okay that the presentation is underwhelming and everything is extremely abrupt, because what matters is that these events are thematically appropriate. It's okay that this subplot went nowhere, because it can be explained and make sense, so it's not a plot hole. Therefore, it's good writing. Themes, themes, themes! That's all people care about nowadays. It's not about that story. It's not about the experience. It's about if it ties into the themes and if things make sense. Because that's all storytelling is, making sense. While Jujutsu Kaisen was still running, I feel like the fans had developed a bad habit of using a lot of the story's messages and themes to justify a lot of the things that it does. You can use the themes and messaging to explain everything all you want, but at the end of the day, some of these things just don't feel satisfying. I was one of those people who was fine with this, who wanted to better my understanding of Gege's writing, even if at first glance it seemed conflicting. But again, that was mainly because I thought these would all amount to something bigger. And that's not just unrealistic expectations. Expectations come from the way the story presents itself. Say what you want about fans trying to make their own ending, but these fan theories weren't just people pulling shit out of their ass. A lot of them were carefully constructed theories or interpretations based on the story given to them. But the hardcore fans feel people are ungrateful for not liking this ending. They're so quick to defend Gege by saying things like, we didn't need this, we didn't need the Heian era backstory, blah blah blah, but they never stop to think about how it could have been better. They're so content with what they're given. They're so willing to settle with a story that they know deep down is capable of more. Oh wait! They're not gonna settle, oh no, because part 2 will maybe, possibly, not really happen. Remember when I said JJK fans get mad at people for having weird expectations? Well, there's another group of JJK fans that will defend this ending from the haters' expectations with the power of expectations. Yay! Guys, let him cook. We have X amount of chapters left. There's gonna be a part 2. The last chapter will have the dream theory. It's Kenjaku's plan all along, or Yuji's domain. There's no way Gege would let it end like this. There has to be more. This will be better later on in the future. If, when, but never is. We have come full circle. Listen, Kaisen fans. Stop. I get you didn't want people to be reactionary. I understand that all my points could turn to complete shit if somehow we get a part 2 announced in the next coming weeks from now. But you also can't expect people to not give their opinions on a weekly series that is meant to be discussed, you'll never get this, weekly. And not just only when everything is said and done. And most importantly, you can't expect people to not be reactionary when you're placing bets on things that don't even exist. Your love for a series shouldn't hinge so hard on what could be. And this is rich coming from me because I had huge expectations regarding this story like I talked about before, but when I see people clinging on to the hope that JJK could one day be peak fiction again, it's just so sad because nothing in these chapters are hinting at a part 2. I was listening to a podcast called the Honored Ones podcast, which I think you should check out, because in one of their more recent episodes, they made a very good point. That the reason people seem to be wanting a part 2 is not because they actually want a sequel or more story to tell, but because they think a part 2 is gonna fix the problems with part 1 of JJK and make these underwhelming chapters better. They're not looking for a sequel. They're looking for a band-aid. Again, I was one of those people who were willing to let Gege cook, but I think we were at the point where whether we loved the ending or hated the ending, we needed to accept that this is the ending. Even at the last chapter, we can't keep making new theories about a potential part 2 or that these last few chapters were a fucking dream. Yes, of course, it has to be a dream and that Gege is leading us on. Isn't it weird that these things are being resolved too easily and too quickly? There's something bigger happening. Surely, this isn't just the result of, dare I say, bad writing? No, Gege would never. JJK fans have this weird thing where they think Gege is this misunderstood genius and he's just trying to throw us for a loop, that his writing style is actually peak and that this is all part of his master plan, when in reality, he's just a human being. He's a human being who is tired, wants to end his story so he can go to the Bahamas and start working on his idol manga. So even if we've been dissatisfied with these last few chapters, we still have to accept that this is the ending we're getting, but also have the sincerity to at least see it to the end. Obviously, I'm not saying we should all stop criticizing something until it's done, but still, it's good to see the whole picture. We enter chapter 270 with a pretty standard epilogue chapter, with some pretty weird implications regarding Kenjaku's character, as he seems to be alive somehow, or maybe this is just a figment of Takaba's imagination and his curse technique, but for some reason he's covered by a speech bubble. Either way, I don't think this is going to be explored at all. And I don't know why Gege is leaving this ambiguous. These are the last 2 chapters. Like, what the fuck do you gain from this? Like, who cares who it is at this point? But other than that, overall, it's just seeing everyone go on with their lives after the events of JJK. It's fine. It's definitely better than 269, but it's just a very basic and uninspired chapter. But even then, I wasn't too bothered by it. I had accepted up to this point that this was the direction the story was going, and I didn't really have a lot of faith that it would get much better from here. But then, something unusual occurred. Tonight was the night. September 25th, the JJK leaks were coming. They got delayed, but came they did, and the final page was leaked first. Fans were outraged. They were like, oh my god, this is the worst ending ever. This fucking sucks. But this was all taken out of context when the other pages finally dropped hours later and we got the full leaks translated. Something happened that I could have never anticipated. The final chapter, it wasn't that bad. It was actually pretty good. It starts off with a kind of typical mission, but honestly, there's something cathartic about it. It feels like this return to normalcy, a gift to the characters after having to deal with all the traumatic events from before. They can finally live on peacefully. This still carries on the happily ever after and everything is resolved feeling from before, but I like the way it's depicted here more. It feels more all-encompassing and touching. There's a bit more soul here than in the last 4 chapters. Gojo's final conversation with Yuji and Sukuna's last moments were very much appreciated, especially on Sukuna's end. One thing that wasn't necessarily needed but still kind of bothered me was that Sukuna's initial conclusion didn't really reveal anything new about him or work to improve his character. But this exchange of Sukuna finding a new path made his initial conclusion much more digestible, and for me added an extra layer to his character like I was hoping for. Honestly, with the final chapter we got, if the last 4 were handled better, this overall could have been a pretty good finale. Maybe not what I was envisioning, and I still think you couldn't really fix the major problems with the story, but it could have been pretty good, maybe even great. But as it stands now, this final chapter is good. It may have not been the ending that I was hoping for, but it does a way better job concluding things than the last 4 chapters ever did, and honestly, I'm fine with it. My opinions will inevitably change with the power of retrospect, and I don't think this is the last time I'll be talking about this story, but for now, I'll say this. Jujutsu Kaisen is an analytical mess. It is a jumble of ideas. When taking a closer look at, you can find tons of nuance in and even rationalize many of the odd choices Gege makes. But when you put them all together, they don't exactly connect the way you want them to, and you're left with a very conflicting experience. JJK is not perfect by any means. It can't be. Its greatest strengths to some are its greatest flaws to others, and a good chunk of what you think of the story depends on what you value in a piece of media. But that doesn't mean the story isn't filled with tons of value. Jujutsu Kaisen is an exceptionally unique series that gives you tons of ideas to draw meaning from, leading to lots of different takeaways from a lot of different people. And whether those takeaways are good or bad, that is probably the best thing a story can do. The last page and interviews from Gege definitely insinuate that this is not the last we'll see from him. And despite my problems with Kaisen, I'm looking forward to seeing what he does next. I really don't think Gege is a bad writer. I definitely think he has issues as a writer, but at the end of the day, this is his first manga. I also don't think Gege needs to completely change his how should we say, peculiar style of writing that he's been running with through Kaisen and adapt to something more conventional, but simply just look at the feedback he's given and try to consider some healthier writing habits. The complaints the Japanese and American audience have are likely very different, but speaking personally, I'd just say, just plan things out better. Flesh things out. Understand what your strengths and weaknesses are as an author, and try not to go beyond your capabilities until you know you're ready. Jujutsu Kaisen may have not been the pixel-perfect 10 out of 10, chosen one, savior of Shonen Jump, the next Hunter x Hunter, 400-page essay, peak of new gen, modern classic, Shonen Evangelion, deconstruction of the battle, Shonen formula, interpretive cinematic experience, avant-garde masterpiece that I was hoping for, but it was still a fun ride, and brought a lot of life to the anime community. If Mei lives, I'm gonna be so pissed. She had. Come on.
Mei is living. It's over. It's over. Just let it go.